Now available in paperback and e-readers, The Legendary Mad Matilda. Get the conclusion to the Spinsterella trilogy at online booksellers today. The whole concept of a comic book character coming back from the dead used to be a very powerful story. And the reason why a comic book character coming back from the dead used to be a powerful story was because death was treated far more seriously 40 years ago than it is today. And the reason why most writers treated death very seriously is because they wanted to relate to the reader how important life was and how valuable life was. So whenever a character like Uncle Ben or Gwen Stacy died, or a character like Barry Allen or Supergirl died, we felt it on the page and it resonated throughout the books because oftentimes characters like Wally West and many others would mourn those characters and they would make us realize that this character was never coming back and we would never see them again. However, we would always feel their impact on these characters' lives in the same way Bruce Wayne feels the impact of the loss of his parents in almost every issue of Batman or other Batman related material. However, with today's comic book world, characters come back from the dead almost within 3 to 6 months, and the resonance of death doesn't have that impact anymore on the reader. If anything, most comic books today feel more like Looney Tunes as it relates to death, in that the character dies, and most comic fans are so cynical, you literally expect this character to come back from the dead in at least 3 to 6 months. When it comes down to the concept of bringing a character back from the dead, I really believe we need to reinvent this whole concept because the whole story about a character coming back from the dead no longer has the emotional resonance on the reader. Now, I remember several stories of characters coming back from the dead that did have resonance with me, and the one that had the greatest resonance with me was the resurrection of Simon Williams, also known as Wonder Man. Now, in this story, Jim Shooter explored the whole concept of a character coming back from the dead, and he told one of the most powerful stories about a character coming back from the dead. And with the character of Simon Williams, he showed how much of an impact death had on a character because we saw with Simon Williams, he struggled with many mental health issues as related to dealing with anxiety and other issues that caused him to freeze up in battle because he feared dying yet again. And we saw him trying to adjust to life outside in a world that had completely changed from the time that he died when he first became Wonder Man. So we saw this character adjusting to dealing with many changes in life because the world had literally passed him by. And he also had to deal with the whole concept of the Vision, who was an android based on his own brain patterns. And dealing with the whole concept of the Vision really unnerved him because the Vision at the time was married to the Scarlet Witch, and that was literally like looking in a mirror at his own life and wondering what could his life have been if he had remained alive. So that was very jarring for Simon Williams. And when you looked at those Avengers stories, they resonated with the reader because here was a man who had died and he had to deal with many aspects as related to his life and a possible future life as he tried to rebuild his life in the aftermath of dying. Now, another story related to the character coming back from the dead that is very popular, but as I see it didn't really resonate because the writers copped out at the end, was the resurrection of your Jean Grey. Now, Jean Grey was sacrificed her life to make sure that her team, the X-Men, did not die in a space shuttle that was damaged, and she had to use a telekinetic shield to protect herself. Unfortunately, she wound up dying in a sacrifice in the Hudson River. And she came back as the Phoenix, and then as the Phoenix, she then sacrificed her life yet again to prevent the Dark Phoenix from destroying everything. Now, at the end of this Fantastic Four issue, they found out that Jean Grey wasn't dead, that she was actually recovering from her injuries in some sort of cocoon at the bottom of the Hudson River all the time that they thought that she was dead as Phoenix. And after Jean Grey came back to life, that's when the whole concept fell apart. We did not get the same depth and substance that we got as related to Wonder Man. Now, with Wonder Man, we really got a lot of depth and substance as related to dealing with the concept of death and the concept of a character coming back to life and dealing with all the conflicts as related to life. I always thought there was a great story with Jean Grey coming back from the dead, but the writers were too scared to tell that story. All the elements were there, with Cyclops getting married and having a child, and many of her X-Men compatriots moving on, and characters like Logan moving on to women like Mariko Yoshida and Storm going punk, and seeing all these changes going on, yet you have this Jean Grey who just came back from the dead from a time that literally was a completely different era into this new era, but the writers were too afraid to tell that story. So your Jean Grey came back from the dead. It was a shock event. And then all of a sudden, she just goes back to Scott Summers. And then Scott Summers decides to discard his wife and his son and abandon them like they're old garbage to go back to his girlfriend. And then the added insult to injury was the whole Inferno storyline where we're told that Mr. Sinister made Madeline Pryor to be a clone. And that to me was a cop out because the real story was about Jean Grey adjusting to the fact that the world had changed completely around her and that people had changed completely around her. And she had to deal with the fact that she would have to rebuild her life in the exact same way that Simon Williams had to go out of his way to rebuild his life in the aftermath of his own death. It was a really rich story to be told with Jean Grey, but your Chris Claremont and many others didn't have the courage to go tell that story about this character and have her dealing with the same mental health and insecurity issues that Simon Williams dealt with when he had to deal with his own death, and asking the question of whether or not your Jean Grey would decide she would ever want to put that costume back on again in the aftermath of so many tragedies. And seeing all these people go on with their lives, that would have really, as I saw it, would have really resonated with the readers and really connected to them and had a really deeper impact on that character. I think that character would have become more popular if they had went on with this story of this character trying to rebuild their life after death in the same way Wonder Man did. And I think it would have really had an impact on readers overall. But they didn't go in that direction. And after the resurrection of Jean Grey, we've really seen death in comics really trivialized and characters coming back from the dead and then just going back to business as usual. Like when I looked at the return of Superman, Clark Kent just comes back, goes back to the Daily Planet, and it's just like business as usual. And I always saw that as a cop out because when people deal with death, there is a grieving process. They deal with 5 stages of grief, they deal with 5 stages of suffering, and they have to deal with their feelings regarding this person who they thought was dead and comes back from the dead. Moreover, this person also has to deal with their own stresses regarding their own mental health because coming back from the dead where you have been gone for so long, there's a lot of mental health issues as a person has to deal with anxiety, they have to deal with depression, they have to deal with their fear of dealing with a changing world because the world has completely changed from the moment that they left this plane and now they're coming back to it. So they're dealing with a lot of fear regarding things. Moreover, if a guy is a superhero or a girl is a superhero, they're going to be dealing with a world that changes as it relates to their mission. So they may have come into the superhero game with one mission, which is that goes one way. However, the world has changed, and the approaches that you would use back in the day would not apply to today. So I think of superheroes who come back from the dead similar to what would happen to Captain America. Captain America, and just like Wonder Man, was a man out of time, a man out of place, and there would be a significant transition time for them to adjust to this different time and the different approaches. Because once somebody's been dead for a couple of years, everything has changed, and when everything changes, their approach to things would change as well. And as they were trying to adapt to things, that would lead to some interesting stories and some interesting issues as related to psychology of a character death and them dealing with death. And other things they would have to deal with are dealing with government bureaucracy. That's another thing I would like to see explored, where this character has died and now they have to come back and try to reestablish their identity with places like Social Security, the DMV, and many other places. Now, the Marvel Universe will sometimes say, oh, S.H.I.E.L.D. will take care of that, or the Wayne Foundation. But I'd like to see a character try to really wrangle with dealing with government bureaucracies and then trying to reestablish their foundations for their lives, and also trying to deal with things like trying to find their apartment or find a job or find things towards rebuilding their life. Because once a person dies, all their assets are dissolved, all their things are usually given away. So all that they had is completely lost. So they have to literally start over from scratch with nothing, and that's a really interesting concept. I think should have been explored with the whole concept of characters coming back from the dead. They're coming back to a world that has completely changed. They're coming back with absolutely nothing, and they're literally forced to rebuild their lives. And as they're rebuilding their lives, they're dealing with numerous people who are trying to deal with their own feelings regarding them. And as they're trying to deal with their feelings regarding this person who some loved and some hated, and how they are trying to deal with the whole fact that this person has been gone, and some of the people have literally tried to forget this person because they either loved them so much or they hated them so much. They're trying to deal with their feelings, and again, that's a concept I would have liked to have seen explored in comics regarding characters coming back from the dead. I would like to see people try to explore characters dealing with their feelings regarding someone who has been gone. And the way you do it in comics these days, it's like, oh, people are happy to see this person come back, but some people, they may not be bad guys, may not be happy to see this person come back because they love that person so much, and they're dealing with the memory of them. And some people are still just trying to deal with the whole memory of a person, because some people hold on to a memory of a person, some to the point where it distorts the picture of that person, and all they see is the ideal of that person that they had in their head, and they cannot reconcile it with the person who is in front of them, a person who themselves is trying to deal with change, because they have this ideal of what they remember them to be, and then the person is dealing with change and becoming someone completely different. And that's another concept that I like to explore with the whole back from the dead thing, is that this person, as they enter the world again, is going to change, because the way they were and the approaches that they used in the past and who they were in the past, that they can't be that person anymore, because they are dealing with a changing world. And that's something that the supporting cast would have to deal with, the whole idea of trying to reconcile the idea of this person with who they are right now. So that's another aspect of a character coming back from the dead that really needed to be explored in comics. Now, the other thing related to this character coming back from the dead in comics I'd like to see explored is the whole idea of the bad guys, because the bad guys also have to deal with the idea of this character coming back from the dead and their feelings regarding them and how they feel about them, because they had a relationship with them as well. Then a lot of times when a character dies, this guy has to really rethink his mission, rethink his focus, and rethink his direction. His goal was destroying this guy, but if this person's been gone for 5, 6, 7, maybe even 10, 15 years, they've moved on to other things, moved on to other feuds, moved on to other things, and they just don't want to run right back to this other guy because that just does not seem logical to me. It seems like, oh, he moved on, and now this guy is back, so he's got to deal with his feelings. Some people, as I see it in the Rogues Gallery, they would have left the whole criminal enterprise altogether, and other people would have gone on to do things like get married and have families and things like that. And that's also something that should be explored with a character who comes back from the dead and could be a bit more in depth as related to their story. I mean, characters have relationships with each other, whether they be good guys or bad guys, and when that person goes away, they have to deal with all the changes as related to it. So, this person coming back, this would be a jarring change for everyone in that world and other aspects of a shared universe. And this is something, again, that really needed to be explored regarding the whole character coming back from the dead thing. And I believe all these aspects would lead to a much richer story as related to these kind of characters. That we really need to explore all these concepts, so that people can get a broader and deeper picture of what death is to a universe, how a character has an impact on others in the universe, and how things resonate as related to them. Because I always thought the way characters come back from the dead these days, the reason why it has no resonance and no impact is because nobody's dealing with their feelings regarding these characters. I mean, I look at DC Comics, they brought Barry Allen back, and he was a character who in Crisis on Infinite Earths had so much impact that people were talking about him, and people like his nephew Wally West and the Elongated Man were grieving him. And this went on for several years, but he comes back later on in about 2009, 2010, and we don't really feel anything from him coming back from the dead. Nobody's dealing with their feelings about it. And the whole thing with his return didn't have any impact because it felt like an act of desperation from the publisher to get sales, but not something to resonate with readers in a story to make us care about that character and see why they were so important to so many people in that universe and so many readers overall. I mean, I look at the deaths of Jean Grey and Barry Allen and how they came back from the dead, and I see how it led to a complete trickle down of all of these types of death and return things that really don't resonate with the reader. When I look at Wonder Man in contrast, that really inspires me to develop an idea for a story about coming back from the dead that's really more in depth, dealing with these characters and how they relate to their feelings about this person, dealing with this character as they adjust to a new life in a new world, dealing with the whole concept of being a man out of time, dealing with the whole concept of feeling out of place, like you don't belong, feeling like you are scared of losing your life again in one of these battles, and dealing with anxiety and depression and dealing with other issues as related to a return, dealing with adjusting to a changed world, with adjusting with people who have changed, dealing with people who are mourning a person, and dealing with people who see you as some sort of historical figure but don't see you as a person, or dealing with people who have a memory of you but don't see you as a human being. Well, these are all concepts I would like to explore in a Back from the Dead story, because when I think of a Back from the Dead story, I think about things like my long term unemployment, which is sort of like being dead in some ways because you're out of the world, you're not in place with the world, and if you're long term unemployed, you feel like you're a man out of time. So when you go back to the world, it's like a major adjustment, and you have to deal with a whole lot of other things in addition to trying to get things started. So I have an idea of what that is for a character who would come back from the dead, because it's just, being long-term unemployed is just like coming back from the dead. If I was able to get another job, it would be like coming back from the dead. You're starting all over from a point where everything ended at one time, and then all these years have passed, and then you have to try to start over, and you have to try to catch up. And that's what a character who's coming back from the dead would be like. It would be like them stopping at one point in their life, being this man out of time, and then trying to catch up, and then trying to understand a world that is completely different than the point that you started from. And then you have to deal with people dealing with their changes related to your life and dealing with the fact that you're dealing with your own changes regarding yourself, and then you dealing with your own internal issues. So there would be a lot going on with this type of story of a character coming back from the dead. And I think it would be a very, very powerful story if they did it today. A story that would literally redefine the whole concept of death in comics and redefine what how important life is and why superheroes go out of their way to preserve life, because when a hero goes out here and puts their life on the line, is to protect others and for people to see how important the sacrifice these heroes make when they go out here, because they go out here to help others, and the greatest help people could give them is the time and support that they would need to try to readjust if they came back from the dead. And I would like to show that in a story where we show this character literally having to deal with all the real issues a person would have to deal with if they came back from the dead, and deal with all the struggles they would have to deal with in coming back to life in a world that is completely different, and dealing with people who are completely different than what they knew in the past, as they try to rebuild a different life that's changing for them as they change in a different future. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct titles like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, The Temptation of John Haynes, and the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.